today we're going to dive into something pretty big.
Yeah.
The new executive order that's all about expanding American timber production.
Oh.
So for those of you who are really into the details of like policy and law and all that stuff, this is going to be right up your alley because it brings together, all those different factors.
Oh, yeah. You got the economics, the environmental side, and even like the history of how we've managed forests.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do here today, right? We're going to break this order down, figure out exactly what it's telling people to do, and then kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Like what led to this? What are the long-term, consequences?
Exactly. Like what's the historical context, what's happening with the economy, and of course the environmental impacts.
For sure. And a big part of that is going to be looking at, what's been going on in the Pacific Northwest, especially with their forests, and then how this thing called globalization, which we hear about all the time, has been shaping the whole industry.
It's huge. And to really get a good grasp on all this, we've pulled together a whole bunch of sources.
Yeah.
We've got the actual executive order itself, and then the official reasons the White House gave for it.
Right, right.
Plus, there's this really interesting article from the Associated Press all about how logging's probably going to ramp up in the Pacific Northwest. And then to round it all out, we've got some scientific studies on how healthy our forests are and some analyses of this concept called social forestry and how globalization has been like a game changer for the American timber industry.
All right, so the goal here is to really give you a clear understanding of what this new policy means.
Yeah.
You know what's going to happen.
Right.
What are the possible outcomes?
Right.
So let's just jump right in. And the first thing we got to unpack is why the White House wants to do this whole timber expansion thing in the first place, right?
Yeah, so they lay out a few main reasons.
Yeah.
First, they're saying we need more timber for basic stuff humans do, like building homes, businesses.
Great infrastructure and all that.
Exactly, and also for energy production.
Okay, so like...
They mention this idea of wood-based biomass, which is basically using wood as a renewable energy source.
Yeah, that makes sense. Timber is like the classic building material.
Totally.
And this whole bioenergy thing is getting a lot of attention these days.
It is.
But I'm guessing they're not stopping there, right? Like this whole forest management thing plays a big role too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So they're making the case that a strong timber industry is key to managing forests well.
Okay.
And a big part of that is reducing the risk of those huge wildfires we've been seeing.
Oh, yeah. And they even mention those recent really bad fires as a reason to take action.
Yeah, that's right.
And the logic behind this is like, if we manage forests actively, thinning out trees and doing some controlled harvesting, we can get rid of all that extra stuff that fuels fires.
Yeah, all that flammable material, they call it fuel load.
Yeah, fuel load, right?
Yeah.
And that way you end up with forests that are healthier and can bounce back better.
Exactly. And that AP News article we looked at supports that idea, saying that getting rid of those dense patches of younger trees could actually help the bigger, older trees thrive.
The ones that are more resistant to fire.
Yeah, exactly. They can handle it better.
So basically the order is saying, we're not using our timber resources enough, and that's actually making the wildfire problem worse and also hurting habitats for wildlife.
Right. The message is a well-managed forest is a healthy forest.
But here's the thing. When we looked at all these different sources, we saw some pushback on that from environmental scientists, right?
Oh, definitely.
It's not quite as simple as more logging equals less fire risk, is it?
Not at all. It's a much more complicated relationship.
Okay.
So some environmental experts are worried that when you do more logging, it can actually make fires worse, at least in the short term.
How so?
Well, when you cut down a bunch of trees, you leave behind all these branches and leftover bits, they call it slash.
Right.
And that stuff dries out and becomes super flammable.
It's like kindling almost.
Right. Exactly. And then there's this whole debate about initiatives like the Healthy Forests Initiative, which was supposed to reduce wildfires through logging, but some folks argued it actually did more harm than good.
By destroying habitats and messing with the ecosystem.
Yeah, so the scientific community is kind of divided on whether logging is really the best way to prevent wildfires.
It shows you how complex those ecological systems are and how scientists can look at the same data and come to different conclusions.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's move on to what the executive order actually tells people to do.
Okay.
What are the main instructions it gives to all the different government agencies involved?
So there's a bunch of deadlines and specific tasks for the secretaries of the Interior and Agriculture,
Okay.
and also agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management.
Right.
One of the first things they have to do within 60 days is come up with a plan for how U.S. Forest Service and BLM projects will follow Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act.
Ah, the E.
Right. And the big goal here is to speed up the approval process for these forestry projects.
So the Endangered Species Act, which is all about protecting, threatened and endangered species, is being looked at to see if they can make it easier for timber production to happen.
Yeah, they're trying to streamline things.
And for our listeners, just to clarify, Section 7 basically says that federal agencies have to check with the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA fisheries
Right.
if their actions might harm any listed species or their habitats.
Exactly. So it's a pretty important part of environmental protection.
And the order goes even further on the ESA, doesn't it?
Yeah, it tells the Secretary of the Interior to figure out if maybe other agencies could handle some of those ESA consultations instead of Fish and Wildlife Service.
Oh, so delegating some of those responsibilities.
And if the current laws aren't flexible enough to make that happen, the Secretary has to come up with ideas for new laws for Congress to consider.
Wow. So they're really serious about making it easier to do all this timber stuff, even if it means changing the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah, it seems like they're really committed to removing any obstacles.
What other specific targets and deadlines are in the executive order?
Well, within 90 days, the Secretaries of the Interior and Agriculture have to present a plan to the president with a yearly target for how much timber they'll sell
Cool.
from those federal BLM and USFS lands over the next 4 years.
So they're putting a number on it.
Yeah, and they're going to measure it in millions of board feet, which is like the standard way to measure lumber.
And to give you an idea, millions of board feet is enough wood to build thousands of typical houses every year.
Right, so we're talking about a pretty significant increase in timber production.
Yeah, that really shows how serious they are about this whole thing.
Absolutely. And there are more deadlines, too. It's not just about the ESA.
Okay, what else is there?
Well, they also got to deal with environmental reviews and more stuff about endangered species.
Gotcha.
So within 120 days, they need to wrap up this thing called the White Bark Pine Range-Wide Programmatic Consultation.
What's that all about?
It's all under the ESA again, and it seems like they're focusing on how to manage this particular tree species.
Interesting. So maybe this tree is important for the ecosystem, or maybe it's causing problems for timber harvesting?
Could be either one.
Okay, what happens after that?
Then within 180 days, the secretaries have to look at adopting these things called categorical exclusions.
Okay, now you're going to have to explain what those are.
Sure. So basically, you've got this law called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and it says that federal agencies have to assess the environmental impact of anything they want to do.
Right.
But categorical exclusions are basically exceptions to that rule.
Okay.
There are categories of actions that the agency has already decided won't have a big impact on the environment, so they don't need a full-blown environmental assessment.
Ah, so it's a way to speed things up.
Exactly, and save money too.
So they're hoping to use these exclusions to make timber production faster and easier.
Right, and also for things like forest management and reducing wildfire risk.
And the order gets even more specific about these exclusions, doesn't it?
Yeah, it says that within 280 days, the Secretary of the Interior has to think about creating a brand new exclusion for timber thinning projects.
Oh, okay.
And bringing back an old one for timber salvage operations, which is basically removing dead or damaged trees after like a storm or something.
So they're basically pre-approving certain types of projects by saying they have a minimal environmental impact.
Exactly. That way they can skip those longer environmental reviews.
It sounds like they're really focused on making things happen quickly.
Yeah, streamlining the whole process.
And it seems like the Endangered Species Act is still a big focus for them.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The order tells agencies to use those ESA regulations about consultations during emergencies to their advantage.
Okay, so like if there's a wildfire or a pest outbreak, they can maybe bypass some of the usual ESA steps.
Right, and it also instructs the Secretary of the Interior, who's also the chair of the Endangered Species Committee, to make sure they're reviewing those applications for exemptions from the ESA really quickly. Right.
They got to spot any legal issues and try to get those applications resolved before the usual deadlines?
So basically making it easier and faster to get exemptions from the ESA.
Yeah, exactly, especially when it comes to timber production.
Wow, so they're pulling out all the stops here.
They are, and there's more. The federal members of that Endangered Species Committee also have to figure out if the ESA is actually creating roadblocks for the timber industry, like if it's preventing them from building infrastructure or something.
Right, and then they have to recommend ways to fix those problems.
Interesting. And lastly, the order tells the Secretaries of the Interior and Commerce to make sure those Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA fisheries folks are ready to do those ESA consultations quickly.
Yeah, especially when there are emergency regulations involved.
So it's like they're trying to grease the wheels of the whole process, make everything run smoothly.
Exactly. They want to get this timber production ramped up.
All right, now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the Pacific Northwest, because that region kept popping up in our research, especially in that AP News article. It's a place with a long history of logging and forest management, so it's going to be interesting to see how this new order plays out there.
Absolutely, and especially after that big deal they made back in 1994 with the Northwest Forest Plan.
Right, the NWFP.
Yeah, that was a major turning point for how they manage forests in that area.
Totally, and from what we've read, it seems like the Pacific Northwest, which relies a lot on federal forest land, is going to be one of the places most affected by this new executive order.
Oh, for sure.
So remind me again, what was the main point of that Northwest Forest Plan, and what did it actually do?
So the NWFP basically changed the whole game for federal forests in Oregon, Washington, and California. Before that, it was all about timber production.
Right.
But the NWFP said, hey, we got to think about the whole ecosystem, protecting those old-growth forests and the habitats of endangered species like the northern spotted owl.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal back then.
It was, and so they made a big shift towards protecting those areas and restoring the environment.
So less logging overall.
Yeah, the amount of timber they took from those federal forests went way down.
Wow, that's a big change. And that whole shift in how we think about forests in the Pacific Northwest,
Yeah,
that's kind of where this idea of social forestry comes in, right?
exactly.
Can you break down what that means?
So social forestry is basically a new way of thinking about how we manage forests.
Yeah.
It's moving away from the old top-down approach where the government made all the decisions, and instead it's all about getting everyone involved, environmental groups, the timber industry.
Local communities, too.
Yeah, everyone gets a seat at the table.
So instead of just the Forest Service deciding what happens, it's more like a collaboration.
Right, a more inclusive process.
And this whole social forestry thing came about because of all those fights over logging and road building in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, those decades of conflict and lawsuits really pushed people to find a new way to manage forests.
And the NWFP was like a turning point in that whole shift.
It was a big deal.
But this move towards more stakeholder involvement isn't all sunshine and roses, right?
Well, it can make things complicated.
Yeah, our sources talked about something called a vetocratic system.
Right, and that word vetocratic kind of hints that things can get slowed down or even come to a standstill.
So what does that actually mean for managing forests?
Basically, it means that all these different groups, like environmental organizations, Native American tribes, community groups, they all have more power now.
Okay.
They can use legal challenges, public pressure, political influence to delay or even block projects they don't like.
So you need to get a lot of people on board before you can do anything.
Yeah, it's a system where a lot of different players have the power to say no.
So it's a lot more complex than just the Forest Service saying, we're going to do this.
Way more complex.
But that AP News article also mentioned that things are changing in terms of working with Native American tribes.
Oh, yeah. That's a really important development.
They're putting more emphasis on collaboration and using traditional knowledge.
They're realizing that Native American tribes have been managing these forests for centuries.
And they have a deep understanding of the ecosystem.
Exactly. So there's this push to include them more in the decision-making process.
Which is a big change from when they were left out of the NWFP back in '94.
It is. It's a step in the right direction.
All right, now let's zoom out even further and think about the economics of all this, especially with globalization being such a big factor.
Right.
We found this report from 2007 called Globalization and Structural Change in the U.S. Forest Sector, and really shed some light on this.
It's a really insightful report.
What are some of the key takeaways from that?
Well, the main point is that globalization has totally reshaped the American timber industry since the early 90s.
Right.
It's made the world a much smaller place, so now there's more competition from other countries.
Right.
And that's led to big changes in how we use our forests.
And this globalization thing doesn't just affect logging. It also impacts other parts of the forest products market, like paper and furniture.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's look at the demand for pulpwood, for example.
Okay.
There's this source on globalization's impact on U.S. pulpwood demand, and it explains how all this global trade and competition has actually reduced the demand for American pulpwood.
So even if we cut down more trees for paper production, the global market might not want it.
Right, exactly. American paper mills are facing competition from places with lower costs.
Right.
And then you've got the rise of recycling, which is partly driven by global trade, too.
How so?
Well, we're exporting more recycled paper, especially to China.
Oh, interesting.
So the demand for fresh pulpwood has been going down for a while now.
It peaked in the mid-90s, and it's been declining ever since.
Yeah.
So that's one example of how globalization is affecting the timber industry. What about other industries like furniture?
So furniture is a good example of how globalization can really shake things up.
Okay.
We're seeing a huge increase in furniture imports, especially from China.
Because it's cheaper to make it over there.
Exactly. Labor costs are way lower.
So that means American furniture makers are using less hardwood lumber.
Yeah, they're just buying it from other countries instead.
Wow. So even if we ramp up timber production here, the demand for certain types of wood might not be there.
That's right. The global market has a lot of power.
What about softwood lumber, which is what we use for building houses?
So housing construction is a bit different because it's mostly a local thing.
Right.
But globalization still has an impact.
Okay, how so?
Well, globalization affects things like interest rates and how much money flows into our mortgage markets. And that can indirectly influence how many houses get built, which then affects the demand for softwood lumber.
Oh, I see. So it's all connected.
It is. And on top of that, we're also importing more oriented strand board, or OSB.
What's that?
It's another wood panel product that's used a lot in construction.
Okay.
So even in areas that seem pretty local, globalization is still having an effect.
It seems like the American timber industry has had to adjust to this globalized world in a big way.
Definitely. And it hasn't always been easy.
That 2007 report also talked about how globalization favors certain types of businesses in the forest sector, didn't it?
Yeah, it tends to benefit the bigger companies that have more money and technology and a more skilled workforce.
Okay.
The smaller, more traditional operations are having a harder time competing.
So it's not just about producing more timber, it's also about adapting to these global forces.
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't a new thing. The timber industry in America has always been evolving.
Right.
New technology, changing demands for wood, new sources of timber. It's always been changing. But globalization has definitely sped things up.
So even with this push for more timber production, the economic benefits might not be as big as some people expect.
That's right. The global market plays a huge role.
Okay, so with all that in mind, what about the economic impact on rural communities?
Right.
That AP News article mentioned that some folks are hoping for an economic boost from this.
Yeah, that's definitely a key argument for expanding timber production. They're saying it'll create jobs and revitalize rural economies that have been struggling. More logging, more trucking, more work at the sawmills and paper mills.
It could be a real boost for those communities.
And it could also mean more money for local governments through taxes and fees.
Though the order itself doesn't really talk about that.
It doesn't, but it's definitely a possibility.
But we also have to be realistic about the potential downsides.
Oh, absolutely. It's not all going to be smooth sailing.
Yeah, our sources talked about how the economic benefits for those rural areas aren't guaranteed.
Right. There are a lot of factors at play.
Okay.
So sure, there might be short-term gains from increased logging and processing. But what about the long term?
Right.
If they don't manage the forest sustainably, those jobs could disappear.
Yeah. And if the global demand for certain wood products changes, that could hurt those communities too.
Exactly. And we have to think about the impact on other industries that are important for rural economies, like tourism and recreation.
Right. If logging leads to environmental damage, people might not want to visit those areas anymore.
Yeah, and there's always the risk of boom and bust cycles.
When the timber market goes up and down.
Right, and those communities that are heavily reliant on one industry are more vulnerable to that.
So the economic benefits for rural areas are definitely something to consider, but we got to weigh them against the potential risks.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue.
Okay, now let's dive into the science behind all this and the environmental concerns that come with increasing timber production.
Right.
You know, we talked earlier about the relationship between logging and wildfire risk
Yeah.
and how it's not as simple as some people make it out to be.
It's definitely more nuanced than that.
So can you remind us what the main worries are?
So when you cut down a lot of trees, especially mature trees, you open up the forest canopy.
Right.
And that lets more sunlight reach the forest floor, which can lead to drier, more flammable undergrowth.
Oh, okay. So even if you're thinning things out in the short term, it could actually create more fuel for fires in the long run.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's that problem of logging debris, the branches and tops and stuff that gets left behind.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, that stuff is like a tinderbox waiting to ignite.
It's a real fire hazard.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you've got climate change, which is making wildfires more frequent and severe.
Right.
And some critics are saying that focusing too much on logging as a solution might distract us from tackling the root cause of the problem.
Which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Exactly. And they argue that we should be investing more in things like making communities more fire resistant.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then there are the broader environmental concerns about habitat destruction and fragmentation, which were highlighted in that opposing perspectives document.
Right. Cutting down more trees can displace wildlife and disrupt the balance of the ecosystem.
Yeah, so it's not just about wildfires, it's about the overall health of the environment.
So it seems like there's a lot to consider here. The potential benefits of logging for wildfire prevention have to be balanced against the potential ecological risks.
For sure, and that's where this whole social forestry approach could be really important.
Yeah.
Getting all those different stakeholders involved can help us find solutions that work for everyone.
And it sounds like the inclusion of Native American tribes is a big part of that.
Oh yeah, they have a wealth of knowledge about how to manage forests sustainably.
So it's a good sign that they're being included more in the decision-making process.
Definitely.
This has been a really deep dive into a very complex issue.
It has.
To sum it all up, this executive order is a big push to increase timber production in America.
Mm-hmm.
And it's driven by a few main things: the need for more timber for construction and energy, the concern about wildfires, and this idea of being more self-reliant.
Right, and we have to remember that this new policy is happening within a specific context.
Yeah.
You know, the history of forest management in places like the Pacific Northwest, the whole idea of social forestry with all its stakeholders.
And the massive influence of globalization.
It's all connected.
It really shows how complicated it is to balance economic development with environmental protection.
Absolutely, and how important it is to listen to all the different voices involved.
So for our listeners, what do you think are the biggest long-term implications of this push for more American timber?
That's a great question, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah.
Will the timber industry actually be able to increase production while still following all the rules about environmental protection and endangered species?
Right, and how will those different stakeholder groups in the social forestry model react?
Yeah, will they be able to find common ground, or will it lead to more conflict?
And what about the environmental impact?
Especially with climate change and the risk of wildfires.
That's a lot to think about.
It is, there are economic, environmental, and social factors at play here, and how they interact will determine the ultimate success or failure of this policy.
It's definitely something we'll be keeping an eye on. So for you, our listeners, I encourage you to dig deeper into this issue. Think about the different perspectives involved: the government, the timber industry, environmental groups, the people who live in these communities.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding their different goals and concerns is crucial for understanding the whole picture.
And it's important to remember that forest policy is always changing.
Yeah.
We're constantly trying to figure out how to manage our forests in a way that's both sustainable and beneficial for everyone.
And this executive order is just the latest chapter in that ongoing story.
Exactly. It's a story that's still being written.